He was just a man in a raincoat, standing in his own driveway at 10 p.m. To Officer Bradley Miller, he was a suspect, a thug who didn't belong in the affluent neighborhood of Silver Lake. Miller wanted a bust. He wanted to assert dominance. He ignored the man's calm demeanor, mocked his questions, and slammed him against the hood of a patrol car. Miller thought he was cleaning up the streets. He had no idea he was putting handcuffs on Justice Isaiah Sterling, a sitting judge of the Supreme Court. Watch what happens when arrogance meets absolute power, and the karma that follows isn't just heavy, it's a life sentence. The air in the Superior Court of Fulton County was so stiff it felt brittle, like it might snap if anyone exhaled too loudly. Officer Bradley Miller sat at the defendant's table, adjusting the collar of a suit that clearly didn't fit him as well as his uniform did. He looked uncomfortable, not because he was afraid, but because he was annoyed. In his mind, this was a farce, a political witch hunt. He was a decorated officer with 12 years on the force. He had commendations. He had a reputation for being tough on crime. And now he was being treated like a criminal because of a misunderstanding. He glanced at the jury. They were stone-faced. He tried to project confidence, leaning back, jaw set. Let them look, he thought. I did my job. I followed protocol. The guy didn't comply. Across the aisle, sitting behind the prosecution table, was the man responsible for Miller's current predicament. Justice Isaiah Sterling. Sterling didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the jury. He sat with the stillness of a statue, reading a document through wire-rimmed glasses. He was 72 years old, an African-American man with hair like steel wool and a face carved from granite. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than Miller's car. There was no anger in his posture, only a terrifying, silent gravity. All rise, the bailiff bellowed. Judge William Hargrave entered. Hargrave was a known hardliner, a man who usually sided with law enforcement. Miller relaxed slightly. Hargrave knows the score, Miller told himself. He knows what we deal with out there. Be seated, Hargrave said, his voice gravelly. He looked over his spectacles, his eyes landing squarely on Miller. There was no warmth in that gaze. Miller felt a prickle of unease. The lead prosecutor, Damian Ross, stood up. Ross was a shark in a pinstripe suit, known for tearing corrupt officials apart. He walked to the center of the room, holding a remote control. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Ross began, his voice low and smooth. We are here today not just to discuss an arrest. We are here to discuss the disintegration of the Fourth Amendment. We are here to discuss what happens when a badge becomes a shield for bigotry. Ross turned and pointed a finger at Miller. Officer Bradley Miller claims he was protecting the neighborhood of Silver Lake. He claims he saw suspicious behavior. But today, we aren't just going to tell you what happened. We are going to show you, and we are going to let Officer Miller's own words hang him. Miller scoffed audibly. His defense attorney, a weary-looking woman named Sarah Jenkins, kicked him under the table. Stop it, she hissed. The prosecution calls Officer Bradley Miller to the stand, Ross said. Miller stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked to the witness stand with a swagger he couldn't quite suppress. He swore the oath, sat down, and looked Ross in the eye. Officer Miller, Ross said, pacing in front of the stand. On the night of October 14th, you were patrolling the Silver Lake district, correct? That's correct, Miller said, his voice booming. High-end residential area. We'd had reports of break-ins. And you spotted the plaintiff, Justice Sterling, in the driveway of 4220 Oakwood Drive. I spotted a male suspect loitering in the driveway, yes. Loitering? Ross raised an eyebrow. In a driveway? He was standing there, looking at the house. It was dark. He was wearing a hood. He fit the description. What description was that, officer? Miller hesitated. Dark clothing, average height, suspicious demeanor. I see, Ross said. And did you know who lived at 4202 Oakwood Drive? No, we don't memorize the phone book. Did you check the license plate of the Mercedes parked in that driveway before you engaged? I didn't have time. He looked like he was about to make a move. A move? Ross turned to the jury. Let's see this move. Ross pointed to the large screen mounted on the wall. Exhibit A, Officer Miller's body cam footage. Timestamp, 10:02 p.m. The courtroom lights dimmed. Miller felt a bead of sweat roll down his back. He remembered the night. He remembered the rain. But most of all, he remembered the satisfaction of taking down a guy who thought he was too good to answer questions. Let them play it, Miller thought. It shows he resisted. The video on the screen flickered to life. The audio crackled with the sound of heavy rain and the hum of the patrol car's engine. The dashboard camera showed the wet asphalt of Oakwood Drive, a street lined with multi-million-dollar colonial mansions. The cruiser slowed to a crawl. Got one, Miller's voice said on the recording. It sounded predatory. Look at this guy, hood up, staking out the place. The car pulled up to the curb. In the driveway of a sprawling brick estate, a man was standing near a bed of hydrangeas. He was holding a small garden trowel and a flashlight. He was inspecting the soil drainage. It was Justice Sterling. He was wearing a dark raincoat. Yes, but underneath, the collar of a dress shirt was visible. He looked up calmly as the police lights flashed on, painting the rain in strobes of blue and red. On the screen, Miller exited the vehicle. He didn't approach cautiously. He marched. "Hey, you!" Miller shouted in the video. "Hands where I can see them. Drop the weapon." Sterling didn't flinch. He slowly lowered the small plastic trowel to the ground and stood up straight. He made no sudden movements. "Officer," Sterling's deep voice cut through the rain. "Good evening. Is there a problem?" "I said hands in the air," Miller screamed, his hand hovering over his holster. "Walk towards me, now." "I live here," Sterling said, his voice remaining level. "I am checking my drainage. We're expecting flooding tonight." "I don't care what you're checking. You look like you're casing the joint. Get over here." In the courtroom, the jury leaned forward. The contrast was jarring. The suspect was articulate, calm, and clearly elderly. The officer was aggressive, loud, and escalating rapidly. On screen, Miller closed the distance. He got right in Sterling's face. "Turn around," Miller barked. "Officer, my name is Isaiah Sterling. My identification is in my back pocket. If you will allow me to—" "I didn't ask for your life story. I told you to turn around." Miller shoved Sterling. The justice stumbled slightly, but regained his footing. "You are making a mistake, son," Sterling said. It wasn't a threat. It was a factual observation. That word, son, seemed to snap something in Miller. "Don't you patronize me," Miller yelled. He grabbed Sterling's arm, twisting it violently behind his back. The sound of the justice groaning in pain filled the silent courtroom. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Miller shouted for the camera, though Sterling was clearly not resisting. "I am not resisting," Sterling gritted out, wincing as his shoulder was wrenched upward. "I am informing you that this is my property. You have no probable cause. Probable cause is you standing in the dark with a weapon. A garden trowel." "Shut up!" Miller slammed the 72-year-old man against the hood of the patrol car. The thud echoed. He kicked Sterling's legs apart. "You're under arrest for loitering, failure to comply, and resisting arrest." "You are violating the Fourth Amendment," Sterling said, his face pressed against the wet metal. "And you are currently assaulting a federal judge." Miller laughed on the recording. A cruel, dismissive laugh. "Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England. You guys always have a story. I know the mayor. I'm a judge. Save it for the booking officer. Miller slapped the cuffs on. He made them tight. Too tight. You're going to spend the night in the cage, Pops. Maybe that'll teach you some respect for the law. The law, Sterling whispered on the tape, is something you clearly know nothing about. Miller shoved Sterling into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed shut. The video paused. The lights in the courtroom came back up. The silence was deafening. Ross looked at Miller, who was shifting in his seat. The arrogance was slipping, just a fraction. Officer Miller, Ross said softly. At any point during that encounter did you ask for ID? He reached for his back pocket, Miller stammered. I feared for my safety. You feared a 70-year-old man with a plastic shovel was going to pull a gun from his back pocket while surrounded by hydrangeas. You never know, Miller blurted out. In this line of work, you never know. Did you check the mailbox? Ross asked. The mailbox right next to where you parked? No. If you had, Ross clicked a button, displaying a photo of the mailbox on the screen. You would have seen the nameplate. The photo showed a brass plaque on the brick pillar. The Sterling residence. You didn't check the plate. You didn't check the car registration. You didn't listen when he identified himself. You assumed that a black man in a raincoat in Silver Lake didn't belong there. Isn't that right, officer? I followed my gut, Miller said defensively. Your gut, Ross said, his voice turning to ice, told you to assault the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, a man who was appointed by the President, a man who has sent people to death row for less than what you did that night. Miller's face turned a blotchy red. I didn't know who he was. If he had just shown me a badge. He tried to tell you, Ross interrupted. You told him to shut up. Ross walked back to his table and picked up a thick file. But the worst part isn't the arrest, Officer Miller. The worst part is what happened when you got to the station. Because even when you found out the truth, you didn't stop. Miller's attorney, Sarah Jenkins, put her head in her hands. She knew this part was coming. This was the part where mistake turned into malice. The courtroom remained in a stunned silence as Damian Ross, the prosecutor, signaled to the technical team. The screen shifted to a new angle, the grainy, fluorescent-lit footage from the booking area of the 12th precinct. Ladies and gentlemen, Ross said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Mistakes happen. Police work is high stress. We all understand that. But what you are about to see is not a mistake. It is hubris. On the screen, the timestamp read 10:48 p.m. Officer Miller walked into the station, gripping Justice Sterling by the upper arm. Sterling was limping slightly. His expensive suit was rumpled, wet and dirty. What do we have here, Bradley? Asked the desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Kowalski, chewing on a toothpick. Another frequent flyer, Miller joked, steering Sterling toward the counter. Caught him prowling around the mansions on Oakwood. Claims he lives there. Claims he's a judge. Miller laughed, looking around at the other officers for validation. A few chuckled. A judge, huh? Kowalski smirked, leaning over the counter. Which court? Night court? Traffic court? Supreme Court, Sterling said. His voice was hoarse but steady. He looked straight at Kowalski. I am Associate Justice Isaiah Sterling. I demand to be released immediately, and I demand to speak to your watch commander. Miller shoved Sterling's head down toward the counter. Quiet, Pops. You speak when spoken to. Empty your pockets, Miller ordered. Sterling struggled to retrieve his wallet with handcuffed hands. Miller ripped it out of his pocket and tossed it onto the counter, along with the keys to the Mercedes and a sleek, black fountain pen. Book him for loitering, resisting, and failure to identify, Miller said, grabbing a clipboard. You got it, Kowalski said. He picked up the wallet. He flipped it open to find the driver's license. On the video, the courtroom saw Kowalski freeze. The sergeant stopped chewing his toothpick. He squinted. He pulled the wallet closer to his face. Then he reached into the fold of the wallet and pulled out a secondary ID. A heavy, federal identification card with a holographic seal. Kowalski's face went pale. He looked up at Sterling, then at Miller, then back at the ID. Bradley, Kowalski whispered. What? Miller was busy filling out the arrest form, not looking up. Put him in holding cell 2. I don't want him riling up the drunks in the main tank. Bradley, Kowalski said, louder this time. His voice cracked. Come here. I'm busy, Sarge. I gotta write this up before shift change. Bradley, get your ass over here now, Kowalski roared. Miller looked up, annoyed. He walked over to the desk. What is your problem? Kowalski slammed the ID card onto the counter. Read that. Miller looked down. Supreme Court of the United States. Justice Isaiah A. Sterling, Idan Tozoso 9. The silence in the precinct on the video was absolute. Miller stared at the card. He blinked. He looked at Sterling, who was standing tall despite the handcuffs, watching him with eyes that seemed to burn. It's fake, Miller said, but his voice lacked conviction. It ain't fake, Bradley, Kowalski hissed. I've seen federal IDs. The hologram is legit. And look at the name, Isaiah Sterling. I learned about him in the academy. He wrote the dissenting opinion on State versus Holloway. Miller's face went slack. The blood drained from his cheeks. Take the cuffs off, Kowalski whispered urgently. Right now. Take them off, apologize, and pray to God he doesn't end your career. In the courtroom, Miller closed his eyes. He couldn't watch the screen. On the video, Miller didn't take the cuffs off. He stood there, his mind racing. He was panicked. If he admitted he was wrong now, if he uncuffed him, he was admitting to false arrest. He was admitting to assaulting a federal judge. He would be fired. He would lose his pension. Miller made a decision. A terrible, selfish decision. No, Miller said on the video. What did you say? Kowalski asked, shocked. I said no, Miller's voice hardened. He resisted. He pushed me. I don't care who he is. Nobody is above the law. If I let him go now, he sues the department. If I book him, we have leverage. We drop the charges if he agrees not to sue. Are you insane? Kowalski whispered. That's a Supreme Court justice. He's a suspect, Miller said, his jaw tightening. Process him. Put him in the cell. Sterling spoke then. Officer Miller, you have a chance to mitigate the damage. Uncuff me. Let me make a phone call. Do not double down on this error. Miller got close to Sterling's face. You think you can intimidate me? You think a badge makes you special? You're in my house now. Miller grabbed Sterling by the arm and dragged him toward the holding cells. Get inside. Miller shoved the justice into a cell that smelled of urine and stale vomit. A drunk man was sleeping in the corner. Miller slammed the bars shut. You stay there until I say you can leave. The video cut to black. Ross turned off the remote. He let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. He put a Supreme Court justice in a drunk tank, Ross said softly, to cover his own tail. Objection! Sarah Jenkins stood up. The officer was following procedure for a non-compliant suspect. He believed the ID might be forged. Overruled, Judge Hargrave snapped. Sit down, counselor. Ross walked back to Miller. Officer Miller, you saw the ID. You knew. And yet, you left a man who has served this country for 40 years, sitting on a steel bench next to a man arrested for public urination. Why? Miller leaned into the microphone. I panicked. I thought, if I charged him, my captain would back me up. I thought we could make it go away. Make it go away, Ross repeated. You tried to blackmail a Supreme Court justice with false charges to save your job. I was protecting the department. You were protecting yourself, Ross shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. And in doing so, you started a war you couldn't possibly win. Ross called his next witness, Captain Thomas Reynolds. Reynolds walked in, wearing his dress blues. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the last 6 months. He took the stand. Captain, Ross began, when did you become aware of the arrest of Justice Sterling? At approximately 6:00 a.m. the following morning, Reynolds said. I came in for the morning briefing. Sergeant Kowalski was distressed. He told me to look at the holding log. And what did you do? I went to the holding cell immediately. I recognized Justice Sterling. I had seen him speak at a law enforcement conference in D.C. years ago. Did you release him? I tried to. Tried to? Ross raised an eyebrow. I ordered Officer Miller to unlock the cell, but Miller had already filed the formal charges with the district attorney's intake system. Once it's in the system, it's complicated to just open the door. So you brought Justice Sterling to your office? Yes. Let's play the audio recording from your office, Captain. Ross pressed play. The audio was clear. It was from the captain's office surveillance. Audio plays. Captain Reynolds. Justice Sterling, I am terribly sorry. There has been a massive misunderstanding. I am going to have these charges voided immediately. Can I get you some coffee? Water? Justice Sterling. I do not want coffee, Captain. I want my phone call. I have been denied my right to counsel and communication for 8 hours. Officer Miller, voice anxious. Cap, you can't just let him walk. He assaulted me. He twisted my arm. If we let him walk, he's going to sue us for false imprisonment. We have to hold the charge. Make him plead to a misdemeanor disturbance. It protects the precinct. Captain Reynolds. Miller, shut your mouth. Do you have any idea who this is? Officer Miller. He's a guy who broke the law. If we back down, we look weak. The guys are watching, Cap. You back the blue, or you back the perp. Which is it? A long pause on the tape. Captain Reynolds. Justice Sterling. If we release you now, can we have your word that this ends here? Officer Miller is a good cop. He just made a bad call. Justice Sterling. Captain Reynolds, you are asking me to engage in a quid pro quo? My freedom in exchange for your officer's immunity? Captain Reynolds, I'm asking for professional courtesy. Justice Sterling, there is no courtesy in tyranny, Captain. I will not make a deal. I will not plead to a crime I did not commit. And I will not protect a man who disgraces the uniform you wear. Now give me the phone, or add obstruction of justice to the list of felonies you are currently committing. Sound of a phone sliding across a desk. Justice Sterling. Thank you. Sound of dialing. Justice Sterling. Hello, Elizabeth. Yes, I know what time it is. No, I am not at home. I am at the 12th precinct in Fulton County. Yes, I have been arrested. No, I am serious. Please call the Attorney General and get the Governor on the line. Yes, tell them to bring the press. Click. Justice Sterling. You might want to tidy up the station, Captain. You're about to have company. Audio ends. Ross looked at Captain Reynolds on the stand. Captain, why did you hesitate? Why did you listen to Miller? Reynolds looked down at his hands. Because of the code, sir. The blue wall. We're taught to protect our own. Miller convinced me that if we admitted the mistake, the media would crucify us. I thought if we stood firm, maybe the justice would just want it to go away to avoid the embarrassment. You miscalculated, Ross said dryly. Severely, Reynolds admitted. What happened next, Captain? About 30 minutes later, the phone in my office rang. It was the governor. He was screaming so loud I had to hold the receiver away from my ear. He said, "What in God's name are you doing to Isaiah Sterling?" And then the cavalcade arrived. Ross turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Miller wanted to treat Justice Sterling like a common criminal. He wanted to break him. But when you strike a pillar of justice, you don't break it. You just ring the bell, and everyone hears it. Ross gestured to the screen. Exhibit C News helicopter footage, 7:30 a.m. The screen showed an aerial view of the 12th precinct. It looked like a siege. 4 black SUVs with federal plates were screeching to a halt in front of the station. State troopers were blocking off the street. A news van from CNN was already setting up its dish. Men in dark suits, FBI agents, poured out of the SUVs. They didn't look like they were there to negotiate. They looked like they were invading. Leading them was a tall woman in a sharp blazer. Elizabeth Vance, Sterling's chief of staff, followed closely by the U.S. District Attorney. The doors of the precinct burst open. Miller watched the screen, his face a mask of misery. He remembered that moment. He remembered the feeling of the walls closing in. He remembered the FBI agent walking straight up to him, looking at his badge number and saying, "You have the right to remain silent." Officer Miller thought he was the law, Ross said, pacing before the jury. But that morning, he learned a very important lesson. There is always a bigger fish, and he had just caught a great white shark. Ross turned to Miller. When the FBI agents entered the building, Officer Miller, "Did you apologize then?" Miller shook his head on the stand. I couldn't speak." "You couldn't speak because you were being handcuffed, were you not?" "Yes," Miller whispered. "Charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime. Yes. Justice Sterling warned you," Ross said. "He told you in the driveway. He told you in the car. He told you at the desk. But you wouldn't listen. And now, the listening part is over. Now is the part where you answer." Ross slammed the file shut on his desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Judge Hargrave looked at Miller. For the first time, the judge's expression wasn't one of annoyance or neutrality. It was pity. "Court is adjourned for lunch," Hargrave said. "We will reconvene at 1 p.m. for the defense." Miller stood up. His legs felt like jelly. He looked toward the back of the room. The gallery was packed now. Reporters, activists, citizens. And in the front row, sitting with perfect posture, watching him with those unreadable eyes, was Justice Sterling. Sterling didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded once, acknowledging the reality of the situation. Karma wasn't coming. It was already here. The afternoon sun sliced through the high windows of the courtroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the heavy silence. The prosecution had rested. The weight of the evidence, the body cam, the booking footage, the testimony of Captain Reynolds felt like a physical burden on the defense table. Sarah Jenkins stood up. She knew she was fighting a losing battle, but she was a fighter. She had one card left to play, the narrative of the reasonable officer. "The defense calls Justice Isaiah Sterling to the stand." A ripple of shock went through the gallery. It was a risky move. Calling the victim, especially a man of Sterling's intellect, was walking into a lion's den. But Jenkins needed to show the jury that Sterling had been difficult, that he had contributed to the escalation. Sterling stood. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the stand with a slow, deliberate gait. He took the oath again, his voice resonating like a cello. "Justice Sterling," Jenkins began, pacing back and forth, trying to exude confidence. "Let's go back to that night. It was raining, it was dark. You were wearing a hood. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Sterling replied calmly. "And you saw a police cruiser approach?" "I did. Now, Justice Sterling, you are a man of the law. You have sat on the Supreme Court for 12 years. You understand the dangers police officers face, do you not?" "I understand the law, Ms. Jenkins, and I understand the Constitution." "Please answer the question. You know that officers have to be vigilant?" "Vigilance is required. Paranoia is not." Jenkins tightened her grip on her notepad. "When Officer Miller approached you, he asked for your hands. Did you comply immediately?" "I lowered my garden tool. I stood still. I identified myself verbally." "But you didn't turn around immediately, did you?" "You argued." "I inquired as to the nature of the stop." "That is my right." "But surely," Jenkins pressed, her voice rising, "as a judge, you knew that simply complying, simply turning around and showing your ID immediately, would have de-escalated the situation. You knew Officer Miller was agitated. Why not just cooperate? Were you trying to prove a point?" This was the Hail Mary, the attempt to paint Sterling as an elitist who baited a working-class cop. Sterling adjusted his glasses. He looked at Jenkins, and then he looked at Miller. "Ms. Jenkins," Sterling said softly, "you are asking me why I didn't surrender my rights to appease an aggressor. I'm asking why you didn't just help the officer do his job. It is not his job to harass citizens in their own driveways," Sterling said, his voice hardening. "And to your point about cooperating, history is filled with men who cooperated and still ended up in a cell or a grave. I did not argue because I am a judge. I argued because I am a citizen. If I, a Supreme Court justice, must grovel to avoid being assaulted, then what hope does a 19-year-old cashier have? What hope does a mechanic have?" "But you could have stopped it," Jenkins shouted. "You had the power to end it by just showing the badge." "I did not have my badge on my person," Sterling said. "I had my driver's license, which I attempted to reach for, and for that attempt my arm was nearly broken." Sterling leaned forward. "Officer Miller did not see a judge. He saw a stereotype. He saw a threat where there was none." "You ask if I was trying to prove a point?" "No, I was trying to check my drainage. Your client was the one trying to prove a point. He wanted to prove that he owned the street. He learned that night that he does not." Jenkins froze. The jury was nodding. One juror, a middle-aged schoolteacher, was looking at Sterling with visible reverence. Jenkins looked at Miller. Miller had his head down. He knew it was over. "No further questions," Jenkins whispered. She sat down. She had thrown the Hail Mary, and Sterling had intercepted it and run it back for a touchdown. The closing arguments were brutal. Ross, the prosecutor, was brief. "Power without restraint is tyranny. Officer Miller had the power of the state. He used it to terrorize a man in his own home. If he can do this to a Supreme Court justice, imagine what he has done to people who don't have a voice. Find him guilty. Not for revenge, but for justice." Jenkins tried her best. Bradley Miller made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it was a mistake born of fear, not malice. He is a human being. Don't destroy his life for one bad night. The jury filed out. The waiting is always the hardest part. For 3 hours the court was in recess. Miller sat in the hallway with his wife, a small woman named Clara who had been crying for days. She held his hand. "It's going to be okay," she lied. "No," Miller said, staring at the floor. "It's not. Did you see his eyes, Clara? He's not just a judge. He's like a force of nature. I messed with the wrong one." "The jury might hang," she said. "Maybe they'll see you were just doing your job. They saw the video, Clara. They saw me laugh at him." At 4:15 p.m., the bailiff appeared. "The jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom filled up instantly. The air was electric. Judge Hargrave took the bench. "Will the defendant please rise?" Miller stood up. His legs were shaking so bad he had to lean on the table. Jenkins stood beside him. Across the aisle, Justice Sterling sat with his chief of staff, Elizabeth. He looked calm, but there was a sadness in his eyes. He took no joy in this. The jury foreman, a tall man in a plaid shirt, stood up holding a slip of paper. "In the matter of the People versus Bradley Miller," the foreman read, his voice shaking slightly. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty." Miller let out a sharp breath, like he'd been punched in the gut. Clara sobbed behind him. "On the charge of assault in the second degree, guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, guilty. On the charge of falsifying police records, guilty." It was a clean sweep. Every count. Judge Hargrave nodded. He took off his glasses and looked at Miller. "Bradley Miller," Hargrave said, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. The sheer arrogance displayed in the evidence provided was shocking. You betrayed your oath. You betrayed your department. And you betrayed the trust of the community." Miller looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Your Honor, I'm sorry." "I am sure you are sorry now, Mr. Miller," Hargrave said coldly. "But I suspect you are sorry because you were caught, because your victim was powerful. The court shudders to think what would have happened if Justice Sterling had been a janitor." Hargrave banged the gavel. "Sentencing is set for 2 weeks from today. Bail is revoked immediately, due to the flight risk and the severity of the federal charges. Remand the defendant to custody." The bailiff moved in. "No, please," Miller cried as they grabbed his arms. "I have kids. Please let me go home to say goodbye." "You had a chance to go home, Mr. Miller," the bailiff said, snapping the handcuffs on, the same metallic sound that had started this whole nightmare in the driveway. "You chose to make this a federal case." Miller was led away, weeping, through the side door. He looked back one last time at the prosecution table. Justice Sterling was standing. He watched Miller leave. He didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted. As the courtroom cleared out, reporters swarmed Sterling. "Justice Sterling! Justice Sterling! How do you feel? Is this a victory for civil rights?" Sterling held up a hand. The cameras flashed, blindingly bright. "This is not a victory," Sterling said, his voice low but captured by every microphone. "A victory would be if I could stand in my driveway without fear. A victory would be if Officer Miller had been a guardian, not a warrior. Today is simply accountability. And accountability is the first step toward justice." He turned and walked away, his coat flapping behind him, leaving the chaos of the media behind. But the story wasn't over. The verdict was just the legal end. The real end, the karma, was just beginning for Bradley Miller. The transport bus smelled of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and old sweat. Bradley Miller sat in the back row, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist, his ankles bound in iron. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big, the fabric rough and stiff against his skin. He wasn't Officer Miller anymore. He wasn't Sarge. He was federal inmate, 49 Ras, 666. The destination was USP Canaan, a high-security federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Miller stared out the window at the passing tree line. He watched the cars on the highway, regular people driving to work, to the grocery store, to pick up their kids. He used to be the one protecting those cars. Now, he was the thing they locked their doors against. When the bus passed through the double perimeter fences, topped with razor wire that glinted in the harsh floodlights, Miller felt a physical weight crush his chest. The gates slammed shut behind them with a sound that was final, loud and metallic, a sound that echoed the slamming of the handcuffs he had placed on Justice Sterling's wrists. "Karma," a voice whispered in his head. "This is what it sounds like." Because Miller was a former law enforcement officer, he was immediately marked as a target. In the unspoken hierarchy of prison, cops were lower than molesters. If he were placed in the general population, Gen Pop, he would be dead within 48 hours, a shank in the chow line or a beatdown in the showers. So for his safety, Miller was placed in the SHU, Special Housing Unit, under administrative segregation. It was a cage, a concrete box measuring 6 feet by 9 feet. It had a steel bunk, a steel toilet, and a steel sink. There were no windows, only a slit of thick frosted glass that let in a grey, diffuse light. The door was solid steel with a small food slot. He would spend 23 hours a day in this box. Year 1. The first year was defined by a burning, corrosive anger. Miller didn't sleep. He paced the 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, like a caged tiger. He replayed the night in the driveway 1,000 times. In his mind, he tried to rewrite the script. Why didn't he just show me the badge? Why did he have to be so arrogant? If I had just driven past, he blamed everyone but himself. He blamed the liberal media. He blamed his captain for not deleting the footage. He blamed his lawyer. But mostly, he blamed Isaiah Sterling. "He ruined my life," Miller would mutter to the walls, his voice cracking. "He has everything: power, money, respect. And he took my little life and crushed it just to prove a point. His only connection to the outside world was the phone. He was allowed one 15-minute call a week. 3 months into his sentence, he called his wife, Clara. "Hey, babe," Miller said, pressing the receiver to his ear, desperate for a kind voice. "How are the kids?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then, a voice he barely recognized, cold, detached, and exhausted. "Bradley, I can't do this anymore." "What?" Miller gripped the phone. "Clara, I know it's hard. But the appeal—" "There is no appeal, Bradley," she cut him off. "The lawyer said there's 0 chance. You're in there for 8 years. 8 years! Do you know what's happening out here? The bank took the house. I'm living in my sister's basement with the boys. Michael got into a fight at school because a kid called his dad a dirty cop. I can't be the wife of the monster on the news anymore." "I'm not a monster," Miller shouted, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "I made a mistake. You broke an old man's arm because he bruised your ego," Clara said, her voice trembling with tears. "That's not a mistake, Bradley. That's who you are. And I don't want my boys growing up to be that." "Clara, please." "I filed the papers today. Don't call here again." The line went dead. Miller stood there, holding the receiver, the dial tone screaming in his ear. The guard, a young man who looked just like Miller had 10 years ago, tapped his watch. "Time's up. 066. Miller went back to his cell, curled up on the thin mattress, and stared at the concrete ceiling. That night, the anger finally broke. It shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, leaving only a dark, bottomless pit of despair. He had lost his badge. He had lost his freedom. Now he had lost his family. He was a ghost. Year 3. By the 3rd year, the rage was gone. It was replaced by a hollow routine. Wake up. Count. Eat the tray of lukewarm slop passed through the slot. Push-ups. Read. Sleep. The isolation was doing strange things to his mind. He started hallucinating sounds. He would hear the rain hitting the pavement on Oakwood Drive. He would feel the phantom sensation of the wet metal of the police cruiser hood under his hands. He stopped talking. He had nothing to say. The only person he saw regularly was the inmate who pushed the library cart down the SU hallway once a week. He was an older man, a lifer named Doc, who wore thick glasses and moved with a shuffle. "Got anything new?" Miller asked one Tuesday, his voice rusty from disuse. "Just came in," Doc said, sliding a thick hardcover through the slot. "Some legal mumbo-jumbo. Figured you might like it, being a former lawman." Miller picked the book up off the concrete floor. The cover was dark blue with gold lettering. "The Architecture of Justice. Liberty in the Age of Authority," by Justice Isaiah A. Sterling. Miller froze. He felt a jolt of electricity go down his spine. He wanted to throw the book against the wall. He wanted to rip the pages out. This man was his tormentor. This man was the architect of his misery. But Miller was bored. Desperately, painfully bored. He sat on his bunk and opened the book. He intended to hate it. He intended to mock it. But as he read, something strange happened. Sterling didn't write like a politician. He didn't write like a bureaucrat. He wrote with a clarity and a moral weight that was impossible to ignore. Miller read a chapter on the social contract. When the state grants an individual the power of violence, the power to arrest, to detain, to use force, it demands a transaction. The officer trades his right to be afraid, his right to be angry, and his right to be biased in exchange for the authority he holds. An officer who acts out of fear or anger is not an officer of the law. He is merely an armed civilian with a costume. The badge is a burden, not a shield. Miller stopped reading. He stared at the wall. He thought about that night. Was I afraid? Yes. He had been terrified of the dark, of the unknown figure. Was I angry? Yes. He was angry that the man didn't respect him immediately. He realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that Sterling was right. He had broken the contract. He had wanted the power without the burden. He kept reading. He read the book 5 times over the next 6 months. He underlined passages with a dull pencil stub. He argued with the book in his head. And then, slowly, he began to agree with it. The book became his mirror. For the first time, he saw himself clearly. He saw the bully he had become long before he met Sterling. He remembered the traffic stops where he'd been rude for no reason. The teenagers he'd roughed up because they gave him attitude. Sterling hadn't ruined his life. Sterling had just been the one who finally held up the mirror. Year 6. Miller was graying now. His face was lined with the stress of prison life. He was 42 years old, but he looked 60. One evening, he asked the guard for a piece of paper and an envelope. He sat at the small steel table bolted to the wall. He held the pen for a long time, his hand shaking. "What do you say to the man you assaulted? What do you say to the Supreme Court justice you tried to blackmail?" He didn't want to ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve that. He just wanted to acknowledge the truth. "Dear Justice Sterling, you don't know me. Or rather, you know the worst version of me. I am inmate, 49 Tua, War Course 066. I used to be Officer Bradley Miller. I have spent the last 6 years in a box. I lost my wife. My sons don't visit. I have nothing left but time. And in that time, I read your book." Page 214. You wrote that justice is not about punishment. It is about correction. It is about restoring the balance that was lost. I want you to know that the balance has been restored. I was arrogant. I was cruel. I looked at you, and I didn't see a man. I saw a suspect. I dehumanized you to make myself feel powerful. I am writing this not to ask for anything. I have no appeals left, and I don't want any favors. I am writing this to tell you that you were right. You told me in the driveway that I was making a mistake. I thought you meant a legal mistake. I know now you meant a moral one. I am sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I betrayed the oath I swore. Sincerely, Bradley Miller. He mailed the letter. He expected nothing. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived during mail call. The return address was embossed, Supreme Court of the United States. Miller's hands trembled so hard he almost ripped the envelope. Inside was a short note, handwritten in elegant, flowing script. Mr. Miller, confession is the first step of penance. Insight is the second. But the third step is the hardest, action. Words on paper are easy. The true test of your correction will not be how you endure your cage, but who you choose to be when the door opens. Do not let your past define your future, but never let your future forget your past. I accept your apology. Now go and earn it. Isaiah Sterling. Miller held the letter to his chest and wept. It was the first time in 6 years he had felt like a human being. The day Bradley Miller was released, it was raining. He walked out of the prison gates with a plastic bag containing his civilian clothes, jeans that were out of style, and a jacket that smelled like mothballs. He had $40 in his pocket and a bus ticket to Philadelphia. No one was there to meet him. Clara had remarried a dentist in Ohio. His sons were teenagers who barely knew him. The world had moved on. The Sterling incident was a footnote in history books. Miller tried to get work. It was brutal. Every time he checked the box for felony conviction, the interview ended. He washed dishes. He hauled trash. He lived in a halfway house that smelled worse than the prison. But he had Sterling's letter. He kept it in his wallet, wrapped in plastic. Go and earn it. One afternoon, Miller was mopping the floors of a community center in North Philadelphia. The center ran a program for at-risk youth, kids who were on the edge of joining gangs, kids who hated the police. He heard a commotion in the hallway. A young kid, maybe 16, was shouting at a police officer who had come in to ask questions about a robbery. "Get off me, pig!" the kid screamed, posturing, chest puffed out. "You got no right." The officer, a young rookie who looked terrified and angry, put his hand on his taser. "Back up. You want to go to jail today, son?" Miller saw it happening. He saw the escalation. He saw the fear turning into aggression. He saw the cycle about to repeat. He dropped his mop. "Officer!" Miller's voice boomed. It still had that command presence, that deep baritone of a sergeant. The room froze. The officer looked at Miller, a grey-haired janitor in a jumpsuit. "Let me talk to him," Miller said, walking forward with his hands open, palms up. "Stay back, sir," the officer warned. Miller ignored him. He looked at the kid. "Hey, look at me." The kid sneered. "Who are you? The janitor?" "Yeah," Miller said. "I'm the janitor. But before that, I was a cop for 12 years. And before that, I was just like you. Angry." He turned to the officer. "And you. You're scared. You think he's a threat. You're thinking about how you're going to take him down if he twitches. You're thinking about your dominance." The officer blinked, stunned. "How do you—" "Because I did it," Miller said softly. "I did exactly what you're doing. I let my ego run the show. And you know where it got me." Miller pulled out his wallet. He didn't show the letter. He showed his prison ID card, which he kept as a reminder. 8 years in federal prison, Miller said. I lost my family. I lost my life. Because I couldn't de-escalate. Because I thought a badge made me a god. He looked back at the kid. And you? You think fighting him makes you a man? It makes you a statistic. You want to beat the system? You don't do it by throwing a punch. You do it by being smarter than they expect you to be. The tension in the room broke. The kid unballed his fists. The officer took his hand off his taser. Miller exhaled. Earn it. 5 years later. The auditorium at the Philadelphia Police Academy was packed. 200 cadets sat in pristine blue uniforms, back straight, eyes forward. On the stage, the academy commander spoke. Our guest speaker today is not a high-ranking official. He is not a decorated hero. He is a warning, and he is a lesson. Bradley Miller walked onto the stage. He wore a simple suit, bought at a thrift store but pressed clean. He looked at the sea of young faces, the future of law enforcement. My name is Bradley Miller, he began, and the most important thing I ever did as a police officer was getting arrested. He told them the story. He didn't hide the ugly parts. He told them about the rain, the arrogance, the twisting of the justice's arm. He told them about the cell. He told them about the letter. You are going to be tested, Miller told them. You are going to be scared. And in that moment, you will have a choice. You can choose power, or you can choose justice. If you choose power, you might win the street, but you will lose your soul. I learned that the hard way. I am here to make sure you don't have to. In the back of the room, unnoticed by the cadets, an old woman sat in a wheelchair. It was Elizabeth Vance, Justice Sterling's former chief of staff. Sterling had passed away the year before, peacefully in his sleep. She listened to Miller speak. She saw the cadets listening, really listening, to the broken man who had rebuilt himself. She smiled. She took out her phone and typed a message to the group chat of Sterling's former clerks. He earned it. And that is the story of how one night of arrogance cost a man everything. Bradley Miller thought he was untouchable because he had a badge. He forgot that the man standing in the rain, holding a garden trowel, was one of the guardians of the very laws he was breaking. This story reminds us that true power isn't about physical strength or authority. It's about integrity. Justice Sterling didn't need to fight back with fists. He fought back with the truth. Miller is still in prison today, paying the price for his ego. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes justice and instant karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Miller's sentence was fair, or should it have been harsher? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.